Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. And today I'm really pleased to welcome Bruce Kirkby. Bruce is from Kimberley, and Bruce has just published a new book called Blue Sky Kingdom. But before we talk about your new book, Bruce, let's just talk about your background a little bit.
Yes, I grew up in Toronto, in the West End, and I went to school for engineering physics, which led only to the most boring possible careers of research or academia. And at the time that I was doing that work, I started guiding rafts on the Ottawa River on the weekends, and I quickly realized that is about 1 million times more fun, and don't worry about the 1,000% cut in pay. So I quit my job, started guiding rafts, and really for the last 30 years I have been leading outdoor adventures and writing about them and photographing them all around the world. And that ended up leading me to Kimberley, where I've been for 14 years. It's been great.
So I was going to ask you how you ended up in Kimberley, but it seems like Kimberley has a bit of a magnetic draw to a lot of people that love the outdoors.
So from an early age I was aware of Pat Morrow, and he was kind of like this guru, like Yoda. And then I was doing a trip in Pakistan and China, and I contacted him. He gave me a bit of help. And then over the years, he often said, you should really think about Kimberley. It'd be a great place to live. And I was always kind of like, yeah, Pat, sure. And I was living in Calgary at the time. And then I basically was looking for I realized the internet meant I didn't have to visit a photo lab. I didn't have to see an editor. I was looking for a place with cheap homes and an airport and a ski hill, and that was in 2004. And I think the only intersection of that kind of Venn diagram was Kimberley. And it was post the mine closure, and I went to look at a house with my now wife. We were dating at the time, and I made an offer that weekend. I'd never owned a house. I'd only owned like a $3,000 rusty Toyota, and moved in 2 weeks later, and I've never looked back. It's been great.
Excellent. So I'm just going to go into talking about your new book. What inspired the new adventure that you launched on?
So it took me 6 years to write this book. So the events of the book are in 2014, and I had 2 young boys and living away in Kimberley, which seems like a nice quiet place. We weren't as literate with distraction and the effects of our devices as we are now. It's become more of a collective conversation we're having. But I got my first iPhone, and I just became aware that this thing was like a tractor beam sucking me in, and I had these 2 beautiful young boys that I wasn't paying attention to. And so the book kind of opens with this catastrophic moment where my son's like, you didn't hear anything I just said, and I'm alone with him on a Saturday morning and it's snowing outside, and I was like, he's right, I got to do something about this.
So that was a bit of a wake-up call for you.
It really was. I knew that I could do better, and I wanted to do better, and so this weird thing that happened with my wife, she's very spiritual, and I'm kind of like the physicist, but we overlapped again in this area of Tibetan or Himalayan Buddhism. I'd encountered that a lot on trips, climbing trips and different journeys to the Himalaya, and always just felt so humbled in the presence of the Sherpas, and kind of, if they had some secret sauce, I wanted to taste it, because they could just deal with all types of things with equanimity and pleasure, and it was so jolly. Christine had studied Buddhism, and so we both kind of in an offhand way said, sometime, let's take our kids and live in a Himalayan Buddhist monastery, and then all of a sudden sometime became that summer.
Interesting. I have to say that most people, when they think about family vacation, don't take it quite to the extreme that you took it to, but a fascinating story for sure. But I want to talk about right from the very start. So you leave Kimberley. What was the first thing you did? So
yes, we may have overreacted. You're right, in terms of, but we had been traveling with our kids, a lot up to that point. And part of our decision was, increasingly it's felt weird going to Asia or in South America, different places, because you jump on a plane, you're in a glassy kind of departures lounge, then you're flying and you have an in-flight meal and watch a movie, maybe read The Lonely Planet, and then all of a sudden you're in Asia or Indonesia, and it just felt wrong to almost like deliver ourselves like an Amazon parcel to a Buddhist monastery in search of stillness. So we decided we'd go overland, which was a challenge in itself. That's a 100-day journey and about 13,000 miles, 20-odd thousand kilometers. So we left our home in Kimberley, paddled down the Columbia River to Golden, left the canoes there, and picked up a train, headed to the coast, jumped on a container ship, went across the North Pacific, and that was an amazing part of the journey and a difficult connection because there's not really many passenger liners plying the North Pacific. And then once we landed in Busan, South Korea, we started this kind of great overland journey going through Korea and China, over Tibet, into Nepal, down onto the scorching hot Indian plains, and then working our way up into the foothills, where we eventually came to the end of the road, left all of that behind, got a team of mules, and did a 10-day trek over the Great Himalaya Range to this really isolated valley of Zanskar. And it's tucked between the Himalaya on one side and the Tibetan plateau on the other. And it's a valley of about 10,000 people that has lived in isolation for roughly 1,000 or 2,000 years. And there's a dirt track that leads into it now, but it's only passable for about 4 or 5 months a year. So you largely have to walk in to get there.
So following your journey, I was fascinated by, the detail that you documented as you encountered various people and cultures and so forth. Once you arrived at your destination, I was thinking in the back of my mind, I was anticipating these people may be a little bit standoffish, but they seemed to be very welcoming to the fact that you made the effort to come and see them.
Well, we had friends in Kimberley who had been actually in Zanskar during a snowstorm and had been put up by, at that time, the head lama of Karshigampa, this monastery we stayed at, the largest of about 10 Buddhist monasteries in the valley. And so they were like, oh yeah, he'd love you to stay, you should go. And we basically, off we went with not too much assurance that there was any idea we were coming. But I should say that I think anyone who's traveled will, there's this common, incredible generosity and welcoming in so many places around the world, particularly in remote cultures and landscapes. And that's furthered by the fact we had children. And, children are this incredible elixir. They open this door when you travel, because if you and I showed up in Zanskar, they'd be, what are these guys doing? Don't they have to work? What are they here to do? Whereas you come with children and it just speaks to our shared humanity, our shared struggles. And in the monastery we were staying at, there was about 17 or 18 novice monks, and so our boys became part of that little tribe of young men. And yes, they opened us with open arms. In fact, there was some discussion on the very first day whether we would stay in the village below. But Lama Wangel, who is now a kind of retired head Lama, was like, oh no, you're going to stay with us. And it was an 8-foot by 8-foot earthen room. And we literally slept in there on transportation pallets, head to toes to head. So we formed this little, basically rectangle or square of our family, and everyone's head was touching someone else's toes. It was a tiny little room. So yeah, lovely.
Well, made it very interesting for you and your family. I just want to talk about your children for a minute. You have 2 sons, is that correct?
2 sons, Bodhi and Taj. So Taj was 3 when we left, and Bodhi was 7.
That's a pretty ambitious effort to take some young children. Did you have any trepidation? Were you worried about the fact that they had a lot to cope with, or?
I'd been taking both boys out since the earliest days. So I actually took Bodhi surfing on the West Coast when he was a few months old, and we spent 2 or 3 weeks surfing. Then we went into the bugaboos. I remember carrying him up, and he was about 3 months old, down to Patagonia. We'd had both boys on a 70-day horse trip in Republic of Georgia. So when you tell people you're going to do this type of journey with children, they go crazy, and they tell you everything that can happen, spicy food, pollution, bad traffic, it's endless. And yes, as a parent, you start to, you think through all of that. You would be irresponsible if you didn't. One of the things that I was most aware of was the altitude. We were going to take our children on a very high train over Tibet, and then trekking probably up to about 5,000 meters, almost 17,000 feet. But I talked a lot to pediatric doctors who specialize in high altitude medicine, and really, just like anything you do with your children, we went cautiously. We left our way out. We made sure we educated ourselves first, and I felt really comfortable the whole way through the journey that we weren't doing anything too crazy. I will say one thing though, on that container ship, it's built for grown men in the crew. And the railings on the side were just these kind of flimsy wires, and there's just the eternity of the Pacific. And if they fall through, it's like falling into the void. They're never coming back. The captain said it takes something like 21 minutes or 7 kilometers for me to stop this ship and turn it around. He's like, they're gone. So we were very careful on the container ship.
I can imagine. Let's just talk a little bit about I believe it's your oldest son. He has some health challenges and so forth. How did you cope with that? Yeah,
so Bodhi's on the autism spectrum, and he'd had his diagnosis around the age of 4 and a half. And so we had a couple of decisions that are probably worth chatting about. One is just to disclose it or not, right? There is a kind of train of thought out there, or a belief that children should be able, or ultimately all of us should be responsible to disclose anything about our own health. So we shouldn't tell, and we should wait till the child's 18. Christine and I didn't feel that way. We're like, man, this is like a central plank to who Bodhi is, how he navigates the world, and what are we kind of telling him by saying, we're going to keep this a secret, until you're older. So we had kind of shared that before. But one of the challenges with autism is a really defining characteristic, and nothing's universal, but highly common, is a desire for regularity and routine. And so many people counseled us that this type of travel experience would be really challenging. Interestingly, we found, in general with Bodhi, the opposite, in that there's quite a bit of routine in travel. There's quite a bit of routine, certainly in wilderness expeditions, because you wake up together as a family every day. You kind of get some food, you move, you find another guest house, you set up your tent. And so within all the uncertainty and insanity of travel across Asia, we built this framework around Bodhi. And I mean, a large part of that book is how he really flourished, not just on the journey, but within the monastery, because some really special stuff started to happen there.
And that is one of the things that really impressed me, is his reaction. It just seemed like it stabilized, and he was able to cope with a lot of things. I was anticipating the chapter where he was put on the horse, and I was thinking, no, this isn't going to go well. But he's just settled right in and just enjoyed the experience, and that must have been fulfilling for you as a parent.
It was a really special time. The thing I think that stands out the most is that Bodhi and Taj had a relationship as brothers up to that point, but they spent 6 months together day in and day out, and the friendship that they formed and the bond that they formed, which is in some ways a little more challenging for Bodhi to open up to that, has endured. It hasn't changed. And I mean, as a parent, what could make you happier? And yeah, Bodhi found certainly, children, they often say spell love, T-I-M-E, and all of a sudden you go on a trip and you create this incredible well, this reservoir of shared experience that you can draw on beyond the trip. And so it had lasting impacts on Bodhi. He had a massive resonance with Buddhism. His name is like a tip of the hat to the Bodhisattva, the kind of Buddha of compassion. In fairness, I named him after Patrick Swayze's character in Point Break, but this was my wife and me again, being a little different. But ever since youngest age, I would go away to Cambodia, bring back a little Buddha statue, and he'd put it beside his bed. He'd put feathers on it and little crystals and gems and leaves. And there was just this really neat resonance. And when there was a moment on the journey where we stopped in a cave in Tibet, we were on our way to Zanskar, and it was a meditation cave, and he asked our guide, what's this all about? And the guide said, well, the monk who founded this monastery spent 7 years meditating here. And Bodhi kind of was like, what's that? And she said, I'll show you, and sit down on this pillow. Bodhi sat down and closed his eyes, and I'm the guy who tries to follow my breath for about 3 breaths, and I'm going crazy. He didn't move for 30 minutes or 40 minutes. And I thought he was joking at first. And then he kind of stood up and said, oh, wow, that was neat. It was like I was nowhere. Ran off to go and pee in the bushes. And so that continued throughout the book. And so yes, it really brought out a beautiful side of Bodhi.
Yeah. So when your boys reflect back on the trip, what do they think of it now?
We talk about it quite a bit. We definitely have a lot of artifacts, if you will. The Lama Wankel gave us these silk paintings that hang in our dining room, and we have little incense holders and different things. One thing that we haven't broached, but was a central part of the start of the trip, and then luckily kind of eased off, was we had a television crew follow us for those first 100 days, and we documented the overland journey, and then they left when we got to the monastery. Watching yourself on TV is kind of like listening to yourself on the answering machine. Not highly recommended. So I do not watch the TV series. It was a 9 kind of part series on Travel Channel. Bodhi and Taj settle in and watch the whole thing time and again. And so they kind of joke. They have these kind of lines that have become, family go-tos. And so that's a great joy of the TV portion of that trip for me, is that the boys, if they were too young to remember the actual events, they remember the television show, yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about that, because it's one thing to take an adventure trip. It's another to have a television crew tagging along and documenting every step of the journey. Can you just talk a little bit more about that experience? And I know sometimes it was a little bit frustrating for you, but it seemed like you were able to cope fairly well.
Yeah, and really my hat has to go off to Christine and the boys. So, you know, I've been involved with television before, and I was actually talking to a producer about other adventure ideas, and I said, look, I can't do anything for the next year. I'm going to Ladakh to live with my family in a monastery. And he's like, hold on, mate, that might be it, the ultimate family relocation. And then started going ahead with pitches, and you realize at one point you're out of control because Travel Channel's giving you the green light, and I've kind of said, Christine, we'll do it, like, I think it's going to be like the long way round style, like you and McGregor, just one embedded camera, and Travel Channel phone to say, well, we've got a different vision. We're going to have 16 camera operators and 8 helicopters, budget for 8 choppers, and I'm like, oh. And so I was a little nervous. Yeah, you get mic'd from the time you're awake to the time you go to bed. The cameras never stop running. But that being said, we traveled with a group. It started as 16. It ended up being in excess of 40 or 50 people by the time, you know, once you're in Asia, you have all types of fixers and drivers. But it was like water off the duck's back to the boys, and we just learned to ignore it but not disrupt it. Like, you try to be helpful. And yeah, in honesty, the television crew helped us do things we wouldn't have done otherwise. They facilitated experiences. We spent a week stuck in Delhi, and Christine did cooking lessons, and the boys got henna tattoos. And I think as parents, we would have just been so exhausted, we would have stayed in the hotel. But interestingly enough, the 16 young men and women who showed up at our house in Kimberley on day one of the journey, or the day before we left, most of them had never left America before. And I kind of realized it's almost like, I'm going to be both a dad and a guide, and, you know, we're just going to have to make this work. And yeah, it was okay. It is stressful to be filmed, and I mean, the best part was they left, and so we had that time alone.
Good thing you had experience as an adventure guide.
Yeah, got a little hairy sometimes.
So I just want to talk about the book specifically for a moment. So it was published by Douglas and McIntyre?
Douglas and McIntyre in Canada,
so one of the biggest publishers in Canada. Hats off to you. And how did that process all work out? And I mean, I have to think that you're very pleased with the outcome, the product that you've got. The book looks great, it reads great, and it really showcases your photos really nicely. What was the experience like?
Yeah, so, you know, going way back to engineering, I never saw myself as a writer or an artist or anything like that. So I went on a trip across Arabia, rode some camels, and I came home and thought I'm going to write a book about this. And all of a sudden I had an agent, and it sold to a bunch of publishers and was translated. And I'd never even written a newspaper article or, a magazine blog. And so I kind of came at it backwards. And by this point, I have, I suppose, established a career as a writer. This was my 3rd book. My 2nd book had a really catastrophic review in the Globe and Mail, and in some ways, it really broke my heart. It killed the book, but it took me about 15 years to recover, probably. And so this was my next attempt at a long book. I spent 6 years writing it. And you asked how I felt about it. It was a really interesting moment for me as an author when, the first box of 12 books arrives at your house. You know what it is. You open it up. The boys were there, and my wife Christine, and you just never know what you're going to feel, and it doesn't happen many times in a lifetime. And here it was in my hands, and it just felt right. I knew that I had done the best that I could. Like, I really pushed myself in the writing in terms of being more than an adventure, talking about my relationships with my family, trying to build the characters of the monks. And all I can say is all of that crystallized in that moment that I held it, and that is a nice feeling. There's nothing worse than having a book, I think, come out and feel like I could have done more, I should have tried harder. Yeah, it feels great.
Yeah, it's a magical moment when you break open that carton for the first time, for sure. So Bruce, what's the future hold?
Well, so I have long been interested in surfing, and that surfing actually kind of came out of that moment when I got that crushing review, because I was in Ottawa promoting my book, basically wandering around downtown Ottawa in tears, feeling just really lousy. And I thought, my God, I would rather be surfing than doing this. And I booked a trip to Mexico and went to surf school. And so surf became a part, surf is a really beautiful thing to me. It's, in a way, the yin and yang of Buddhism. Like, Buddhism forces you to learn to control your mind so you're present with no other props. Now, surfing, you are very, very present, largely because of your immersion in this environment that has all the shifting energy around you. I just love being out there, love being in the water. I'd read a book called Caught Inside about 20 years ago about a man who spent an entire year basically surfing the same coastline. And I said to Christine that I want to do that at some point in my life. And so we had decided we were going to leave basically right now and spend a year surfing, and then COVID happened. So That's still coming.
Yeah.
Right now, I'm enjoying exploring the I mean, one of the beauties of COVID, isn't it, that we really get to immerse ourselves, travelers, in our own travel in our own home, in our own valley, in our own environment, and so. Yeah, that's something that I'm enjoying, and I don't have any kind of deadline on when the restrictions lift. We'll go surfing.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, Bruce. Your book again, Blue Sky Kingdom. It came out earlier this year. It's a great read, and I really appreciate you documenting that family adventure and really putting it down and sharing it with everyone. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me for a chat. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah. My name is Keith Powell, and this has been Talking Kootenay Books.